Welcome to the Japanese Pragmatics Workshop. As you may know, the way we see things and the way we interact with others affects the way we use language. This includes how often we use certain words and phrases. It also suggests that when we communicate with someone, we're not just using words to convey information, but we're also using our body language and showing some emotions. So for when learning a new language like Japanese, it's not enough to just learn the grammar or vocabulary, we also need to pay attention to how people use language to communicate in social situations. This video aims to improve your understanding of how people interact with each other when they're speaking in Japanese. In this lesson, we'll learn a new concept called subjective and objective construal. The most common linguistic phenomenon related to this concept is the use of the first person in Japanese through watashi, atashi, boku, and ore. And this is a core part of the Japanese language. Let's get into it by starting with an exercise. How would you say these utterances in Japanese? Online translation tools like Google Translate or ChatGPT might translate it like this. However, while it may be grammatically correct, it is more natural for Japanese speakers to omit the pronoun, a grammatical particle like ga, or the subject of the sentence when the context of the conversation is already established. In fact, using anata to a stranger or someone who is older than you sounds impolite. So here are the natural sounding versions. Why is this the case? Because English and Japanese are typologically so different. Japanese and English have different ways of describing events. In English, people often describe events in an objective way, meaning they include themselves and all the actors in the description. In Japanese, people often describe events in a subjective way, meaning they don't say what is obvious to them. The Japanese language is organized around the experiencer. That means they do not include themselves in the description. It helps Japanese language learners a lot if they understand these differences in how events are described, but nobody teaches this, so here I am teaching this to you. English often uses an objective perspective when describing events. The speaker describes what happens using themselves and their language because they see themselves in the scene. In this way, all the people or things involved in the event are visible in the language, so the sentence usually includes subjects and pronouns. This way of describing events is like looking at them from a bird's eye view. The bird sees everything, and then everything is mentioned. The scoba at the right corner shows the speaker outside the scene looking down like a bird at everything, so they describe everything in their language. The speaker is at the circle with the eyes, and the experiencer is treated the same as everything else in the scene and is mentioned in the same way. In Japanese, on the other hand, grammar is organized around the experiencer. This means the person experiencing the event is understood as being there and doesn't have to be mentioned. This way of organizing grammar is called the subjective perspective. There is no separation between the person speaking and the event being described, so pronouns like I or you are usually not needed. To help visualize the subjective perspective, it can be compared to a snake or little insect that's viewing the events up close. In the right corner, the scoba shows the speaker who is merged into the scene in subjective construal. They don't mention themselves because what is most obvious is everything else in the scene. Let's compare how a question would be asked in English using the objective perspective and in Japanese using the subjective perspective. If you were lost and asking for a direction in English, you might say, "Where am I?" This is an example of using the objective perspective where the speaker is mentioned in the scene they are describing and uses pronouns like I to refer to themselves. I can say, "Where am I?" or "Where are my keys?" and I am mentioned just like any other object in the scene. In Japanese, however, the same question would be asked differently, organizing it around the experiencer using the subjective perspective. Instead of asking, "Where am I?" you might ask, "Koko wa doko desu ka?" Literally, where is this? In this way of asking the question, the experiencer is not included in the language because they are embedded into the scene and the attention is on the other things in the scene. It's important to understand construal patterns in Japanese. It is also important to understand intersubjectivity or joint intention. Intersubjectivity refers to the joint intention shared between the speaker and their conversation partner. Achieving intersubjectivity helps learners better understand how to communicate with other people. Understanding these concepts can be especially helpful for you as you can become more comfortable with the language's pragmatics. You'll be more aware of interactional resources, including interactional particles ne, yo, and yone, which you will learn in the second half of the pragmatic workshop. So far, you have learned that English and Japanese are typologically different, and English favors objective construal while Japanese prefers subjective construal. So do you think that English speakers always use the objective perspective? The answer is no. We know now that there are two ways to describe events in the world, objective and subjective. Both English and Japanese can describe events in both ways. However, English usually treats the speaker and other agents equally and tends to use objective language. On the other hand, Japanese is organized around the experiencer, so prefers to merge the speaker into the scene and not mention them using subjective language. So in Japanese, agents are not mentioned when they are understood from the context. Let's look at these examples of English sentences framed objectively and subjectively. In subjective language, other information and words may also be left out when they can be understood from the context. So as you can see from these examples, in English, subjective construal happens, but mostly in informal situations. This puts the focus on the action. So far, we've learned that similar situations can be expressed in different ways that are associated with different perspectives. The picture above shows, "I can see the lighthouse," and the picture below shows, "There is a lighthouse." So which one is objective construal and which one is subjective construal? From what we've learned, we can see that the picture above represents objective construal, while the picture below represents subjective construal. Now let's summarize what we've learned in this video. In this video, we learned that the Japanese language is organized around the experiencer. That is, in Japanese, the experiencer is at the center, part of the context that doesn't need to be mentioned. We call this subjective construal. This is realized in Japanese in different ways. For example, we see the non-use of I, or zero subject. In Japanese, first-person pronouns like watashi, atashi, boku, and ore are generally not stated in conversation. And that there are also impacts on the use of interactional particles and speech styles, but this is for another day. I hope that you've learned something new that you can use in your Japanese conversation practices. Thank you, and I will see you in the next video.